Hello everyone, Kent.Bressler here. I want to welcome you to Kent's Kidney Stories. During our time together over these podcasts, I'd like to discuss kidney disease. I'd like to tell you about my journey as a transplant patient, but also talk about dialysis, kidney donation, and just about anything else that might be of interest. Kent's Kidney Stories, podcast endorsed and sponsored by kidneysolutions.org. Hello everyone, this is Kent.Bressler, and we're going to be doing a little podcast today, and I've got a real special guest who's turned out to be one of my good friends. Anyway, I want to say a little prayer this morning. Got some difficult times going on. I just thought a little prayer would help us before we get started. Father, today I pray for peace and understanding for all of your children. Our focus must be with you and on you at all times. And our prayer is one of thanks. Bless us, O Lord. Amen. Okay, my guest is Payal Shah. Payal's been on a couple times, well, at least once that I know of. Anyway, she is a PharmD, and she works very closely with drugs for kidney patients. I mean, it's just that particular. She's very knowledgeable, and I wanted to bring her on because there's a drug on the market now, and it's been there a while. Belatacept is the terminology. That's Belatacept. Belatacept is unique. It's in its different world. And so what I wanted Payal to do this morning or today is to try to kind of wrap our arms around what it's good for, and just kind of expose you to it, because I don't think in my own mind that it's as well disseminated in the kidney world. I know people are on it. I get that. I see a few people on it here and there, but it's not like your Prograf or your Imuran or your Sandimmune. And I think she'll play that out for us. And so consequently, she has a great outline. So I want to just shut up and let her talk. Payal, tell me about Belatacept.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me, Kent. I always enjoy coming on the podcast. So, really the goal of today, like you had mentioned, is to bring some exposure to our immunosuppressant regimens. And I will preface by saying that there is no ideal regimen. Each drug that is part of I call it the triad effect, but we all know that there's more than 3 medications involved at times. There's no one ideal regimen. Everyone reacts differently. And to be frank, each transplant center has a very different protocol, and they will be implementing whatever based on the data that they have on their patient population, transplant patient population. That's what they will go to in terms of their protocol. And really, as we know as transplant recipients, that the goal of immunosuppressive regimen is to prevent rejection of your organ. And, just to name off, you named a couple of medications off already. So, we're talking Prograf, which is FK506, or tacrolimus, azathioprine, cyclosporin, mycophenolate, which is Cellcept, sirolimus. I mean, there's a whole slew of medications. And the way I like to think about it is that different drugs do different things in the body to really help the body prepare and accept that new organ. And the way that I look at it when I talk to fellow transplant patients is that, because everyone always asks, well, what are you doing to have so much success with your organ, and so on and so forth. And really, an ideal regimen includes a variety of drugs that pinpoints different time periods of the transplantation process. So, initially when you're getting ready to have a transplant, in those initial few days or weeks, you'll have a desensitization therapy. Then you'll have an induction therapy. Then you'll have your maintenance therapies, which is what you and I, Kent, and even Jason, who's post-transplant, we are all on maintenance therapies, which is really sustaining the life of the organ now. And so really the goal is to have a perfect balance between toxicity, rejection, infection, and malignancies. And what's interesting is that many of the drugs, I'll take our cyclosporin and tacrolimus, for example, they're actually considered nephrotoxic, which means that they're damaging to the kidney, which is such an oxymoron because we're using that for our kidney. And so, what that means when I say nephrotoxic is that they can cause high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and we may be familiar, those of us listening, of NODAT, which is new onset of diabetes after transplantation. And, to your point, you mentioned Belatacept, it really hasn't gotten that much momentum within the transplant community, but I do think it's something worth noting is that a lot of our medications that we may be on, minus Belatacept, we are at an increased risk of acquiring diabetes if you were not diabetic prior to your transplant. That because of these medications, we're at an increased risk of having diabetes after the transplant because of our medication regimen. And so these are just some of the key things I want our listeners to keep in mind as we go through Belatacept, just to understand, what are some pros, if you will, with the use of Belatacept. So what I'm going to do is probably just kind of, talk about Belatacept. We'll kind of talk about how does it work, how is it given, things like that, and hopefully we can just have a good conversation about it.
Sure.
So in my research as I was preparing for this talk, I found that Belatacept is considered one of those backbone agents. And so in the clinical trials for Belatacept, it was used with the corticosteroid. So it was used with prednisone. So, I know a lot of centers are going steroid free. And I'm going to pause right there. And I'm going to also preface this by saying these are always conversations to be had with your doctor.
Exactly.
And as a transplant recipient and as an advocate and just I'm only here to disseminate the information, not going to tell you what to do, but definitely a good conversation to have with your doctor to determine if Belatacept or any medication for that matter is appropriate for you. So in the clinical trial, there were 2 clinical trials that brought Belatacept to the market. It was called one was the benefit study, which was the main clinical trial. And then they had an extension study, benefit extension. So those 2 trials together really brought Belatacept. Otherwise, the brand name is called Mulogix. It's by Bristol Myers Squibb. Those are the 2 studies that brought the drug to the market. And like I was mentioning, is that it is considered a backbone agent. So that means you would use it in conjunction with either Cellcept or Rapamune or azathioprine, and you would also be on a corticosteroid. So chances are you will be on a prednisone. And the reason why prednisone is important is because that's how the clinical trials were conducted. And the clinical trial was set up so that patients were either receiving the prednisone with Belatacept or cyclosporin. So cyclosporin was the control agent that was used in this clinical trial. Long story short, it was approved in 2011 by the FDA, and it was thought that it had a better side effect profile than many of the current regimens that are being used. And so it could be a good option for patients that are at a higher risk of diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure. So definitely a good conversation to have with your doctor. Now, how does it work? It's known as a co-stimulation blockade agent, which is selective for T cells. Plain and simple, it works by reducing these inflammatory and immunologic mechanisms. As we know that our organs our newly transplanted organs are considered foreign to the recipient's body. And so similar to all these other medications that are out there, it really just reduces that response that our body would force up in order to reject this organ. So similar mechanism. It's pretty complicated. There's a lot of science behind it. I'll be honest, it certainly was a little confusing to kind of simplify it. So I'm just going to leave it as it just helps reduce that inflammatory and immunological response that you would have. It's given every month as an IV. Now, once you get your transplant, you get it. It's via infusion, so you would get it as an IV pretty frequently, immediately after transplant. But once you've reached that maintenance dose, it's every month, and that dose is based on your weight as the recipient. Now, when we're talking about the side effect profile, unfortunately, it's all part and parcel of taking these drugs. Some things to remember is that the doctor will test you for what's called Epstein-Barr virus. So what this means is, you might know it better as mono. The Epstein-Barr virus is kind of, based on my research, that at some point in time, we've all been exposed to this. Whether or not we show symptoms is definitely dependent on the patient. Now, what's important about Belatacept and the Epstein-Barr virus is, prior to a patient starting Belatacept, the doctor will test your blood to determine if you've been exposed to this virus. And why is this important? Because if you've not been exposed, you are not a candidate for Belatacept.
Yeah, okay.
The reason for this. Yeah, the reason for this is one of the main side effects of Belatacept, which is actually pretty serious, is called PTLD. And what does that stand for? That stands for post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. It's a mouthful. But basically, it involves the immune system, and white blood cells, which are known as lymphocytes, they multiply out of control. And this is so if you haven't been exposed to Epstein-Barr virus, you're at an increased risk of PTLD. And so what happens when these white blood cells multiply, full-blown growth can cause lymphoma, which is essentially a type of cancer, and it can be life-threatening. Based on my research, there are 4 types of PTLD, and they can range in severity. And being that we're immunocompromised, we put ourselves at the highest risk.
Exactly.
And so patients should be seropositive, meaning we should have these antibodies in our blood prior to starting Belatacept, which means that we have immunity to, I'll shorten it to EBV. And so that's why it's really important to get tested prior to starting Belatacept, and the doctor will test you for this.
They're gonna test you for sure. That's a standard. Yeah.
Do you know people that are on Belatacept, and how are they faring with the drug?
They're doing well. You mentioned here I assumed, and this is my part after I've done my research, is that a lot of the use of Belatacept is for people who have been transplanted and they start to reject. Okay, it's the rejection process that they're already in. So you implement the treatment with Belatacept because it's not nephrotoxic, and that's as simple as it can be put. It doesn't damage the kidney like these others do. And it doesn't damage it right away, these other drugs. It's over the long haul. So when you and I, you being 22 years out, me being 33 years out, we've been immunosuppressed, just like you said, what happens is you creep, your creatinine creeps up, your body ages, your kidney ages. And I've always felt that it would be a good source, if I qualify underneath, to use that in place of what I have. I'd be willing to try that. And so I don't want to confuse you or get you out of your train of thought here, but I have known people who've come out of surgery post-op first time and been started on this. I've also known people who've had a transplant starting on a second transplant and they've used it. Okay. It's pretty well-known drug in the big university centers, but out and about, I don't think that it's being used that much. I may be all wet.
I would agree with you. I actually have not come across, as far as patients go, I've not come across anyone that is on Belatacept. But to your point, I think a lot of the academic, bigger institutions are aware. And I think one of the biggest important take homes on Belatacept is, based on the clinical trial, the 2 clinical trials that brought Belatacept to market, of the patients that were treated with Belatacept, 5% developed the new onset diabetes after transplantation by the end of 1 year, as compared to 10% of patients who were taking the cyclosporin. And of course, post-transplant, that's when that first year is critical for determining if you're going to have that new onset of diabetes. So within those first 2 years is really a telltale sign, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind for patients, is if you are at an increased risk of diabetes, if it's a family history or what have you, perhaps it is worth considering and talking to your doctor about.
Absolutely.
Now, I will say that at the end of the 3rd year, which was the extension trial, the benefit extension trial, the cumulative incidence of, I like to say no DAT, of the new onset diabetes was 8% as compared to 10% with cyclosporin. So it did creep up.
It creep up, yeah.
But
you made a very important observation, and you told people, and I want to reinforce it. None of this is fail-safe. None of this is a cure. None of this can happen without a discussion with your physician. If you can't discuss this with either your nephrologist or your transplant team or together, you're missing the boat here. Expecting that to be something that you want to do has to be researched with your physician. And that's plain and simple. None of this stuff, it's all out there in the literature. You can all read about it. Everything is there. But it's you and your physician that make the decision. That's the right. Most important. And you mentioned that, and you did a good job of that. And that made me feel good, because I was concerned about, when we started talking about this drug, that everybody would get the idea that it was the cure-all. It is not.
No.
If it was, we'd all be on it.
Absolutely. And I know we always talk about advocating for yourself, and you have to do the research. I will say that between the FDA, the package insert, the website for Neologics on Bristol-Myers Squibb, they've done a nice job of outlining, pros and cons, because with every medication, there is a side effect profile that goes along with it. And just like my regimen is not going to be appropriate for you,
No.
Vice versa. Belatacept is not going to be for everyone.
No, exactly. That's the point. Exactly. This is just an exposure. We want people to know about it, right?
Absolutely.
You and your doctor will, you talk to your doctor about it. That's where it'll happen.
Absolutely. And the package insert does a nice job of saying this is only for kidney transplant. So I know that liver transplant patients, lung transplant patients, or heart transplant patients might be looking at this as an option. It is not. The clinical trial was only conducted in kidney transplant patients.
Another important point.
Only in adults. They did not study it in pediatric patients. So you must be over the age of 18 if you're a candidate for Belatacept. So just a couple key things to keep in mind.
Okay, Payal. We talked about all of the conditions like Epstein-Barr and PTLD, and the conversation with your doctor. I had always assumed that this drug was used like for transplants only, and you mentioned it, and that's good. In your mind, what I had thought about in the long term, being out as long as we are, at some point in time, we may have to make a decision because of the nephrotoxicity, and this drug I thought would be at least something we don't have anything else to look for. Is there anything am I on the right track here? Or do you think that this drug, what's the only thing we have to offer, right?
Yeah, I think the beautiful part about Belatacept is that it kind of takes the guesswork away from you as a patient, meaning that as far as compliance goes, you need to go in to go receive your Belatacept. So you're not guessing day to day if you've taken it, not taken it. You actually physically have to go in to an infusion center and receive the medication over a span of 30 minutes. So as far as compliance goes, as far as knowing that you're going to get your dose, it helps in that regards. And to your point about the nephrotoxicity, I think you're right. I mean, as it stands right now, the options are kind of limited, and I will say it's not without its own, you can run the risk of anemia and UTIs with Belatacept, and you're still at an increased risk of cancers of varying degrees. And so it's not that it's without its negative side, but to your point, I think there is room to consider it if you are a candidate, and if by doing your due diligence and doing the research on it. That being said, I think just in general, nephrology is in a very crucial time point right now that there are a lot of eyes on in nephrology and in the kidney space that practitioners know, researchers know, scientists know that we need to up the bar for our transplant, for dialysis and transplant patients. And we need to spur innovation. We need to spur drug development on both spectrums, dialysis and CKD, dialysis and transplantation. So, to your point, I don't think it should be a discounted drug. I think there's the data shows that actually patients have a better estimated GFR measurement as compared to cyclosporin. So certainly the data is there to support its use. As long as you're a candidate.
Yeah. Another thing too about longevity, and this is not to brag about how far we're out. It's to give people hope. And I keep saying this, it's not about me being 33 years out or you being 22 years out or somebody else being 48 years out or, right at the century mark, 50 years out. The point is that you go into your physician, your nephrologist, and you're doing okay. Your creatinine's good level, good. Your not really your GFR, but your creatinine level is good. And most nephrologists, and you say too, what about Belatacept? Oh, listen, buddy, I don't want to mess with that. You're doing fine. And his response or her response is, listen, why rock the boat? I get that. All I'm saying is, please entertain it, because this kidney may go south, and it's all I have. So what that is a viable option. This drug is a viable option. There's nothing else unless you can tell me that. But the nephrologists, they're not going to rock the boat, and I've agreed with that all my life. I believe that trying to change it just for the sake of changing it to get better numbers is not what we're about, right?
Absolutely. I tell you, I'll give you an example of me. I just had a doctor's appointment this week on Wednesday, and my blood work, he was like, it's pristine, because I'm always talking to him about my prednisone and my Rapamune. Like, can I not just start lowering my dose a little bit? I'm 22 years out, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, no, I'm not. He's like, I will not, use your words, rock the boat. I will not do it. He's like, why compromise another potential 5 to 7 years that you may get from this kidney?
Or 20.
Or 20, who knows? And so that's right. I will say that I think maybe a university, academic institution, a training, site, they might be a little bit more aggressive maybe, and willing to challenge the patient as far as their immunosuppression regimen. But certainly I understand his point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had my physician say, I won't do it. I won't adjust into something else because there is nothing else that works any better. But if something happens where you start into a rejection, then we'll discuss this thing. But I will not change your regimen as long as you're doing well. Because if you want me to do that, I won't. If you want it done, you'll have to go somewhere else. And I've been told that.
Yeah. Okay,
so in other words, get in the car, close the door, and stay in your lane.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't rock the boat.
Okay with that. Listen, you're delightful. I just can't believe how smart you are in this whole drug world. Plus, being a transplant patient. Come on, in 22 years, you've done something right. You've done something right, but you really can't explain it, can you? It's just something that you do. You live to be. You had to transplant to live.
Absolutely, and a lot of it is graced by the higher beings that be, the higher powers that be, and just taking care of yourself. And I'm happy to, I'm happy to kind of dissect all the medications one at a time, and certainly talk about them. And we can go through each of the drugs, talk a little bit more about what they're doing, what they're not doing, and some possible side effects, and what the data is showing with these medications, if that's helpful, and hopefully just provide some insight.
Well, maybe this vehicle that we're doing, this podcasting, and this is just between you and me and the rest of people listening. I don't know how many people are listening. It could be 5, it could be 10, but over the course, it may be 100, maybe 400. I don't know the numbers. But this presentation is something that I think should go where there's a big listener, lots of people. I don't know what that venue is, but I'm going to find it. But I want you back with me on this podcast because you are very knowledgeable, and you're living because you had a transplant, but you're also living because God put you here to do what you're doing. All right. And I believe in my deepest heart that if there weren't people like you, we wouldn't have a good control of what's going on. Okay. Thousands of us I know out here working at this project. But if you have something that will help people and you give it out like you're doing, God bless you, young lady. You're it. I really appreciate you. All right?
I
All right.
appreciate you too, and everything that you do.
All right. Listen, like I tell my folks out there, just make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? Take your medicines, go to your doctor's appointment. Don't cheat. Don't cheat yourself. You're not cheating anybody but yourself by not paying attention to what you're supposed to do. If you don't understand what you're supposed to be doing, call your doctor. He'll tell you. All right? So, in keeping with my belief, I want you to, everybody out there, just keep breathing.